stands before you. One by one we will take you.
This is a top 5.
Or a top 10 in our case.
Yeah, it is a top 10 because there's 2 of us, and you do 5 sci-fi and I do 5 horror. We're continuing with our quest of the 1960s.
Wow.
It ended up being a big piece to bite off and chew, so we split it into 2 sets of 5 years. We did 1960 to 1964 last time, and we are doing 1965 to 1969 this time.
And I found it really interesting to examine the decades because, like, I struggled in 60 to 64 finding really good sci-fi, and you had a plethora of horror. And now it's reversed. I had so much from 65 to 69, some of probably the best science fiction ever, 65 to 69. And I'm not sure how you did horror-wise, but I'm sure.
Well, I had trouble finding the 5th one. Yeah. I had a lot of trouble. And I ended up, I think I told you off camera that I watched 17 films.
Yes.
And finally decided which one it would be. And then very similar to the first half, there's a lot of context because there's a lot of crap out there. So I basically cut most of the crap, especially the stuff I've not heard of. And then when we get to context, I'll mention movies that other people might have heard of or seen. And by all means, folks, if you want to comment and let us know that we left something out, please do, because it's possible we overlooked something. So.
Oh, yeah. And we would love to know your guys' reactions to what our top 5s are. So let us know definitely in the comments down below there.
Yeah, but 1965 to 69, well, I was alive.
Yes, we were.
And it was a great 4 years for movies as far as regular mainstream movies. We had movies like The Graduate, Mike Nichols with Dustin Hoffman. We had The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah, Bonnie and Clyde, The Sound of Music, Midnight Cowboy, Cool Hand Luke, Dr. Zhivago, and In the Heat of the Night, just to name a few.
Oh, yeah.
Big movies.
Well, late 60s were huge. And I think that's when a lot of people were glomming on to the Academy Awards and more character-driven stories. Cool Hand Luke, The Graduate, and the auteurs were starting to take over. So to me, the 70s are all the auteur era. That's when you had one visionary director and he had studio support and he just did his movie, whether it was Serpico or Star Wars.
Right. So, I think of the 70s as gritty.
Yeah, 70s is very great. Well, the 60s started, though, remember, because that's when Grindhouse was there and the drive-in movies and all that started in the 60s.
Easy Rider, that's one I left out. I think that came out in 69, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, late 60s is when all of that started happening. And it became easier and easier to get your hands on camera equipment. You didn't have to have a great, big, huge CinemaScope. You could take your little 16 millimeter and start shooting movies with it. So a lot of artists came about, but I still think the late 60s is some of the best for science fiction ever. So,
well, the horror side was changing, evolving, as we're saying. It seems like it evolves every 5 years. Creators like William Castle and Roger Corman were pretty much already past their prime as directors, but Hammer, which I mentioned last time, was still going strong. And then toward the very end of the decade, as you said, science fiction was finally being taken more seriously with like big budgets and critical acclaim. Well, I guess we should get on to the first one then.
Our top 5. Dun, dun, dun.
I want to tell you my secret now.
My number 5 is a little movie that we have covered. This one is a Hammer film. This one's called The Devil Rides Out. Terrence Fisher and Freddie Francis were the 2 main directors for Hammer. You see their names a lot. But the reason I like this movie is it's a script by Richard Matheson, an American. Stars Christopher Lee, of course, and Charles Gray. And it's the Hammer film where a duke and his friends confront a devil-worshipping cult led by the sinister Makata, played by Charles Gray. I think the reason this movie sticks out to me is it's a devil worship movie. And those were coming into fashion around this time and into the 70s.
When did we cover that? What season did we do? Was it fourth season?
It was at least third or fourth.
Because I'd never seen it when we watched it. So it was interesting. Yeah.
I'll put a link to it in the video, though. But that's my number 5.
Guys, I'm bringing the party to you.
My number 5 came out in 1969 called Marooned. Directed by John Sturges. It is realistic science fiction, for lack of a better genre moniker. Stars Gregory Peck, Richard Crenna, David Jensen, James Franciscus, and Gene Hackman. I mean, a great cast. Ironically, came out 1 month after we landed on the moon. It's the story of 3 astronauts whose retros refuse to fire and they're stranded in orbit. And what would NASA do to try to save these dying astronauts in orbit?
Back then, nothing.
How would you get another rocket even on the pad in
Right.
time? It took months to even get a rocket ready. Gregory Peck is the lead, and he's his normal Gregory Peck awesome self as the head of NASA. And how do we get this done and not kill these guys in space? So that's my number 5.
Will somebody get this big walking carpet out of my way?
Well, my number 4 is a little movie that has 2 titles because it was released in England and it was released in the States under different titles. It's called Witchfinder General.
Ooh.
But it is also known as The Conqueror Worm. 1968. Director was Michael Reeves. We have talked about him recently because Michael Reeves directed that movie The Sorcerers, which also came out shortly before this in the late 60s. This one, though, however, is his best film. Not many of you know this because you don't know who Michael Reeves is, but he, I guess, had a drug problem. Anyway, he died right after he made this movie, and he was only 25.
Wow.
Yeah, he was very young. And he did not get along with Vincent Price when they were making this movie. And it's one of Vincent Price's best movies. So it may have worked to his advantage. In it, a soldier seeks to put an end to the evils caused by a vicious witch hunter named Matthew Hopkins, played by Vincent Price, who terrorizes his fiancée and kills her uncle. Matthew Hopkins was a real person. Did you know this?
The Inquisitor?
Yes.
No, I did not know that, but it does not surprise me.
I'm sure the events of this were dramatized, but he killed over 300 people.
They were all witches.
Well, it was men, women, it didn't matter.
Yeah,
but anyway, if he didn't like you, he would have you hung or burned or drowned or whatever. So anyway, that's why this movie is a good horror movie to me, because it is very shocking.
Nobody touched nothing.
My number 4 best science fiction movie of the late 60s is Fahrenheit 451, 1966.
Truffaut.
Francois Truffaut directed it, and it was based on the Ray Bradbury novel. A really great examination of not just the literary work that it was inspired by or was taken from for source material, but it is a terrifying look at the future and people just burning books and removing them from libraries and saying books are not important anymore. And that terror, I'm sure to you as an author, is palpable, but it was a great movie version of it, I thought.
I love the ending of it, especially.
Yes.
Because the ending is somewhat uplifting.
It is, which, contrary to the book, as we talked about in the podcast, the book ends very depressingly. The movie has hope at the end of it. But Julie Christie's in it, Oscar Werner. It's a great science fiction film. If you have not watched it, do not watch the remake. Watch the 1966 version.
She's alive! Alive!
Speaking of terrifying, my number 3 is a movie I had never seen. And I went out of my way to watch it and was quite riveted to it. And it is a little movie called Repulsion. 1965, black and white, Roman Polanski.
Yeah.
And Catherine Deneuve. Or Deneuve, how do you say that?
Deneuve. I think Deneuve. Yeah.
This is Polanski's first English language film and the one that put him on the map. He's a Polish director. It's surrealistic and disturbing. It's set in England, London, that is.
Yep.
And it's about a sex repulsed woman who disapproves of her sister's boyfriend and how she sinks into depression and has horrific visions of rape and violence. She loses her shit, man. I mean, basically, her sister and her sister's boyfriend go away and leave her in the apartment for a weekend. And that weekend, she just goes deeper and deeper into madness.
Mm-hmm.
And people die. That's all I'm going to say.
They're dead. All right, can I go now?
My number 3 happens to be, I think, one of your favorite movies we have covered in the podcast. It was written by Michael Wilson and Rod Serling, based on a novel by Pierre Boulle, and directed by Franklin Schaffner. At the time, became one of the most popular franchises in movie history, let alone science fiction history, but then inspired another franchise that is now still going on even today in 24. It is a little film that came out in 1968 called Planet of the Apes.
That is in my top 5 movies.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, you heard it, folks. A science fiction film is in my top 5 movies, and it is
Yes.
Planet of the Apes. Love
It
that movie.
is such a well-done film. Iconic in so many ways, from makeup to the final image, to the storytelling, to the lack of dialogue, to the music, direction, just everything.
Concept.
Concept alone, yeah.
Yeah.
But excellent science fiction. Would not really be science fiction. It would be a survival story, really, except for the beginning and the end, which tie this whole time travel future Earth. Influenced so much science fiction for decades and still is, even now. Andy Serkis has a job now, thanks to Planet of the Apes.
Wow. And we had Charlton Heston, of course.
Of course. Those damn dirty apes.
You lobotomized him.
You
cut his brain out.
This town needs an enema.
Okay, well, my number 2 is, I guess what you could say, a pair. I had several pairs in my last top 5 of the early 1960s, and I'm about to do another movie directed by Roman Polanski, and that is Rosemary's Baby.
Wow,
1968. This film was not shot in England. It was shot in America, and it featured Mia Farrow, John Cassavetes, Ruth Gordon, Maurice Evans. Speaking of Maurice Evans, who was also in Planet of the Apes.
Yes.
This was written by Ira Levin. This is the movie that skyrocketed Polanski into fame. And it's the story of Rosemary Woodhouse, a pregnant woman who suspects her husbands and neighbors are part of a sinister cult with very dark plans for her child.
I think that's a giveaway description that's not accurate to that movie.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think she suspects a cult until like near the last quarter
She
of that
doesn't,
movie.
but I don't think she knows she has a creature inside her. I think she's worried that they're going to do something.
Yeah, possibly, but I think
And
it's
then
much
you
more-
realize, oh, she's carrying the Antichrist. Yeah.
Damien.
Yeah, or the devil's spawn.
Yeah.
I love this movie. I love this movie
Me
for
too.
Ruth Gordon alone. I think
Yeah.
she is fabulous.
She is.
And we covered it fondly, I remember, as a Christmas episode.
Yeah.
Come on, buddy, we're not out of this yet.
My number 2 movie of the late 1960s, I think you'll probably agree with, again, we've covered it, came out in 1966, stars Stephen Boyd, Raquel Welch, Edmund O'Brien, and has incredible special effects to it that still hold up today and look pretty good for half of it. Directed by Richard Fleischer, it is called Fantastic Voyage. The story of when a blood clot enters a politician's head, they try a new technology of shrinking scientists and a submarine, injecting it into his bloodstream, and they have to go and try to repair the clot from within his head before they grow to normal size. So there is a time limit on it. I remember you and I talking about it on the podcast because we were talking about those old clocks they used to have that flip letters down because that's what they have in the control booth. And it's like the size of a wall and the clock keeps clicking down every minute sort of thing. Before digital technology, folks, we could shrink people and their submarines. So there you go.
And put them into your bloodstream.
Yes. And Raquel Welch in a very tight suit. There you go. How can it be wrong
Being
for young
attacked
boys?
by antibodies.
Antibodies, yes.
I see dead people.
My number one is Biggie. It is a movie that I've often said I think is probably the most influential film in horror. 1968, George Romero, Night of the Living Dead. I mean, this was a no-brainer for me because it's probably one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a sensational film about a group seeking refuge in a farmhouse from reanimated corpses. And the tensions rise in the farmhouse, which is the same theme you have today with what's worse, the humans or the zombies, because they're practically killing each other inside the house as well as being eaten or killed outside the house. Political, I don't know that it was meant to be political because he had not intended to cast a black leading man, but he did not change a thing. He just let the script roll as it was, and it ended up making a giant political statement. I think it was just accidental, which is what makes it so great, because it's not forced. And I don't know, what all has this movie inspired? Well, if you're watching any Walking Dead show now, then that came from it. Not to mention 28 Days Later and all the fast zombies. And there's lots of movies that this movie was inspired by, but I'm not going to get into that because I think I talked about that last time.
There's lots of podcasts that this movie inspired, like ours. So there's that. I mean, I think we looked into it when we covered it originally, but to me, this is the birth of zombies. Zombies prior to this were those robotic-looking things in a Haitian island or something that the witch doctor would reanimate in order to do something. This whole concept of, no, they are carnivorous dead
ghouls.
That are ghoul, yeah. And it just spawned this entire subgenre that is, to me, is the equivalent of a vampire now. And vampires had been around for decades before this.
And my first novel was a zombie novel. Yeah.
There you go.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
My number one, just like yours, it was a no-brainer for me. You look at it and I go, what is the number one science fiction movie of the late 60s? Oh, wow. I guess I'm going to have to go to a movie based on a book that was written at the same time by a famous sci-fi author, Arthur C. Clarke, and directed by one of the best directors in the history of cinema, Stanley Kubrick. And it's, of course, 1968's 2001, a story that follows the birth of man and intelligence aided by alien interference all the way up through a metaphysical journey through time and space by the end of it. It revolutionized the way science fiction was perceived. Suddenly, science fiction could now become big budget and make money, and you could do fantastical things. And all of this, the special effects still hold up today. They were all practical effects. There were no computers used whatsoever. It looks amazing. The spacesuit, the design, the production design, everything. And it was done a year before we even landed on the moon. Wonderful.
It's funny. I knew when we were doing the late 60s what our number one movies would be.
I did too. I knew you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
we know each other that well, but.
And cinema. I mean, it speaks for itself. If you guys disagree, come back and let us know. If you don't agree with at least our number one picks, tell us why and what should we have picked instead. Because, I mean, even the entire 60s, not just late 60s, the entire 60s, the number one science fiction film has to be.
And look how it has reversed. Because in the first half of the 60s, my number one was big budget Alfred Hitchcock.
Yep.
And now my number one is low budget George Romero that was basically shot out of the trunk of his car.
Yeah.
And as soon as they got finished with it, they drove it into the city and tried to get people to play it at movie theaters. That was their distribution.
Please show a movie.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. So we've gone over the top fives. Did
Yeah.
you have any honorable mention?
I had a few. One we had done before on the show. So Quatermass in the Pit was
Okay.
really close to being in my top five. I just felt that Marooned was a much better quality film and acting and cast and everything by that.
It was a movie I remembered from my childhood when we did it, when we covered it.
There was also another one that we had mentioned, maybe covering, it's on our list, and it's similar to Marooned, but different. It's called Countdown. It's again about a stranded astronaut, but it's only a singular stranded astronaut. And it's James Caan, and he's stranded on Mars. And it's a very Harlan Ellison-esque story, but it came out in 1967, and it's a good story. And then my last two, another space or set in space one, Journey to the Far Side of the Sun. This was done by Jerry and Sylvia Anderson, the same ones that did UFO and Thunderbirds and a lot of 60s science fiction, Space 1999. But this was a film that was a very heady concept at the time. It was the assumption or the theory that this was a multiverse before people had talked about multiverses as far as cinema goes. So there was another alternate Earth on the other side of the sun with an alternate Tim and an alternate David and an alternate, Roy Finnis is the astronaut, and he is trying to figure out, is this a dream? Am I really dead in space? Is this really happening? So it's all this creepy, weird, I don't know what's real and what's not, Matrixy feel to it. And my last one is on our list, and hopefully we'll do it soon. It's Charlie, which was based on Flowers for Algernon, the novel, and also turned into a play, and a more Earth-based societal science fiction story, much more like Fahrenheit 451 without it being all society. It's basically about a handicapped man who volunteers for a special operation, and he becomes a genius, and then halfway through they realize that his new abilities are going to reverse themselves.
All right. Well, my honorable mentions, I did something like I always do. I paired them up because we have so many, and I've got a little bit to go, folks, if you're going to stay with us. First, I did Hammer films because they were still going strong, as I said. The two best ones, in my opinion, are Dracula, Prince of Darkness, which was the sequel to The Horror of Dracula, which we've covered on the podcast. And I think I chose last top five we did. I think it was in my top five. Anyway, the stars, it's directed by Terrence Fisher. Again, we mentioned him. It's got Christopher Lee and Barbara Shelley. Then I chose another movie that has two titles because one was distributed differently in America. It's called The Witches, but in America, it was known as The Devil's Own, and it stars Joan Fontaine. I had never seen this movie, and I watched it. Yeah, I mean, it's basically about a woman that witchcraft seems to follow her. She leaves like a third world country that she's a teacher in, like a mission, because of natives using witchcraft and voodoo, and she's just terrified, and so she leaves, and she ends up in a small town, and lo and behold, the women of that town are doing it too.
They're all witches. Everybody's
And it was back in that time where old stars were trying to rejuvenate their careers with modern movies. We saw Bette Davis and Joan Crawford in our last top five do Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Well, this was Joan Fontaine trying to do the same thing. Number two, anthologies. This movie almost made my top five. It was between this and The Devil Rides Out. It's a movie called Dr. Terror's House of Horrors.
Okay, sure.
This is an Amicus movie. They look like Hammer movies, but it's a different company.
Right.
They also star and use the same directors. It's directed by Freddie Francis, stars Lee and Cushing, and it's basically about a guy in a train car with four other guys, all businessmen in their suits, and he pulls out a deck of tarot cards and starts reading everyone's future. And it's an anthology film, so of course each one of them has something horrible that's going to happen to them. And I'll leave it at that, but it's the same formula for like Tales of the Crypt or Creep Show or any of those things. So I have a fondness. And the other one is a little bit different, but it's still an anthology. I picked a television series pilot, and it's Night Gallery.
Oh, excellent.
And it stars Ossie Davis and Roddy McDowall in the first one, which is very memorable because
Mhm.
it's about a graveyard next door to a house. And it also stars Joan Crawford. Again, I mentioned that older actresses trying to revive their careers in a little segment
Directed
directed
by
by
who?
Steven Spielberg.
Yes. One of the
Yeah.
greatest directors of all time. Yes.
Yeah. And then the last one I always forget. But anyway, those are the two that are the most memorable. It was a pilot for a series from Rod Serling, Twilight Zone, that went for 3 years. And then three, I picked two very strange ones.
Okay.
Because they're influential, and one of them is science fiction. The first one is Spider Baby, 1967, starring Lon Chaney Jr. This movie basically is responsible for movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and House of a Thousand Corpses.
Spider Baby?
Spider Baby. It's about a weird family. Yeah.
Okay.
A weird, murderous family. So I'll leave it at that. It is on the top list of a lot of, I guess you would say, independent cinema or, I don't know, drive-in movies, whatever. But Spider Baby, if you've never seen it, check it out. I think it's on our list, actually. And then the other is one that you should have at least mentioned in your honorable mentions, and it is Planet of the Vampires. It is also known as the Demon Planet. I'm not sure which one was American or which one was Italian, but it is a Mario Bava movie.
Yes.
And the sets, well, the sets are great, but the costumes are fantastic. And this movie influenced Alien. If you watch it, you'll be like, oh my God, Dan O'Bannon liked this movie. You can tell.
Okay.
And it's on our list as well. So those are my two influential movies. And I have context. Do you have context? Because you said you had more sci-fi.
Context. What do you mean? Context.
Other movies that were out and floating about that people had heard of or seen. This is not a good movie, but a sci-fi that I know came out in the late 60s is that movie The Bubble with the guy from the Mod Squad. I can't think of his name. And it's low budget and not great, but the concept alone has always intrigued me since I was a kid. It's where Stephen King got the idea of Under the Dome. Basically, a small town is trapped under a dome. It's like Mayberry by aliens. And anyway, what I meant by context is other movies that did not make our list or our honorable mentions. And I'm going to mention some, as I always do. Sure. Hammer Films, as I mentioned, were going strong. They had movies like Plague of the Zombies, The Reptile, Frankenstein Created Woman, The Mummy's Shroud, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. I went with another category that I went with last time because I really couldn't figure out how to categorize it, and I did Familiar Faces. We had Die Monster Die, featuring Boris Karloff. It's an adaptation of The Color Out of Space by Lovecraft, but it's very loose. So trust me there. There's a movie called The Skull that Amicus did with Leah Cushing that gets good ratings. I didn't get a chance to watch it, so that's another one that's on my list. Island of Terror, which you have mentioned to me.
Yes.
And see, you could have mentioned that as well because that's sci-fi. The Torture Chamber of Dr. Sadism, which was a German film starring Christopher Lee and is on Prime, folks, believe it or not. The movie It, ! With Roddy McDowall. I've talked to you about that. I think I did it as a genre piece in one of our episodes. The Shuttered Room, which is also known as Blood Island, is a August Derleth Lovecraft hybrid starring Gig Young, Carol Lindley, and Oliver Reed. I have never seen this movie, but that alone makes me want to see it.
I have seen that movie about 5 times. The last time I remember watching it was probably 20 years ago, but it was scary even then.
Oh, I've got to watch it then. The Sorcerers, which we have covered or are fixing to cover, I believe, on our podcast. I don't think that's aired yet.
Yeah.
With Boris Karloff. That's the other Michael Reeves film I mentioned. Curse of the Crimson Altar, which is also known as The Crimson Cult. I did watch this. This is a movie pairing Karloff and Christopher Lee and Barbara Steele. I mean, that alone makes me want to watch it. And I did. So, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, I did not get a chance to catch this. This is a Dan Curtis television movie with Jack Palance. I want to see it.
No.
And Denholm Elliott is also in it.
Okay.
And then The Oblong Box, which features Price and Lee and is also a Poe story. Foreign films, I watched Hour of the Wolf. I told you about this. It's Ingmar Bergman with Max von Sydow. It's beautifully shot and horribly boring. I cannot tell you how boring this film is. And then one movie I could not find a copy of called Spirits of the Dead, which is a Poe anthology directed by Roger Vadim, Louis Malle, and Federico Fellini. It stars Jane Fonda, Bridget Bardot, Terrence Stamp, and Peter Fonda. And then lastly, comedy crossovers, and there's a reason why that's last. I just don't like them. Polanski did The Fearless Vampire Killers, and there's also a movie called Carry On Screaming. So yeah. That's a lot for the late 60s, I think. If we left anything out, please be sure to let us know.
Yes. Listed in the comments down there. Make sure you like and all of that stuff, subscribe. That way you can find out about all of these wonderful top fives that we're doing in addition to our other shows.
Yeah, we haven't done one that's not a year one in a while, so maybe we should do like the influential one or something.
Yeah, I like that influential one. And if you guys have suggestions for what you would like us to pick our top 5 sci-fi and horror related, let us know. We'd love to know what you would like us to talk about.
I totally agree, because these things obviously I'm obsessed with and they make me start watching tons of movies. So
yep. Obviously 17 just for this podcast.
Yeah. And if this is not enough for you, we have other shows on YouTube. Our regular show, Johnny Has the Keys, of course, where we take one film weekly and dive into it deeply. We also have Shutter with Tim and Streaming with Tim, which is just me rambling on like I am right now about a horror movie, only in a short format. Coming to Get You is about stuff that's coming to theaters that piques our interest. And if that's not enough for you, we always appreciate your support over on Patreon, where we have bonus shows as well as some subscription material or subscription shows of the X-Files and Star Trek, the first, or not the first season, but the original show.
Yeah.
What is that called? TOS?
TOS.
The original series. That's it. We did that. I'm tired.
That is it.
Gotta go. Thanks for watching, folks. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
You can't start the car. Johnny has the keys.